Greetings and welcome to this evening's Ken and Jean Hansen Lecture, sponsored by the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College. Tonight's lecture features Dr. Kristen Page, professor of biology at Wheaton College, giving the second of three presentations on the topic Creation's Call, Stewardship Lessons from Middle-earth and Narnia. Tonight's respondent will be Dr. Noah Toly, professor of urban studies and politics and international relations. During and after the presentation and response, you are welcome to pose questions to each speaker through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, not the chat button, but the Q&A button. My co-director, Dr. Crystal Downing, will be curating questions from audience members and posing them to tonight's speakers. The Ken and Jean Hansen Lectureship is an annual Wheaton College faculty lecture series named in honor of the former Wheaton trustee, Ken Hansen, and his wife, Jean, and endowed in their memory by Walter and Darlene Hansen. Tonight's lecture is entitled A Lament for Creation. Dr. Kristen Page is the Ruth Kraft Stroshine Distinguished Chair and Professor of Biology, excuse me, and will be presenting the second of three lectures using the fictional landscapes of J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis as a means to aid us in developing a greater real-life appreciation for God's creation. She holds an MS in zoology and wildlife from Auburn University and a PhD in forestry and natural resources from Purdue University. And now let us listen and learn from Dr. Page's presentation, A Lament for Creation.
Thank you, Dr. Downing. My screen. It's so nice to be with you tonight, and I just want to say once again, thank you to the Wade Center and to the Hansens for this opportunity for me to learn from Lewis and Tolkien about creation care. Just like in my first lecture, this lecture will be accompanied by much of my photography. And in this lecture, a lot of the images that you'll see will represent some of the degradation that I've been talking about that we will learn about in this talk. So what does it mean to love your neighbor in the year 2021? There are more than 7.5 billion people currently living on Earth, and every single one of us needs resources provided by creation. Obviously, we need water and food just to live, but we also need other things like timber and fiber so that we can have shelter and clothing and fuel to move us around town or beyond. God in his love has given us not only a beautiful world, but one rich with resources that provide us with all we need to live life fully and thrive. The problem is that many of us use resources beyond our immediate needs. And when we use more than we need, it changes what is available to our neighbor. Have you ever considered that to care for creation is to love one's neighbor? Consider this example from J.R.R. Tolkien's The Return of the King, known as the Scouring of the Shire. In this passage, the hobbits have returned from their long time away and many harrowing days fighting the evil that was threatening Middle-earth, only to find that the same evil has despoiled the Shire. As Tolkien explains, it was one of the saddest hours in their lives. The great chimney rose up before them, and as they drew near the old village across the water, through rows of new mean houses along each side of the road, they saw the new mill in all its frowning and dirty ugliness, a great brick building straddling the stream, which it fouled with a steaming and stinking overflow. All along the Bywater Road, every tree had been felled. As they crossed the bridge and looked up the hill, they gasped. Even Sam's vision in the mirror had not prepared him for what they saw. The old grange on the west side had been knocked down, and its place taken by rows of tarred sheds. All the chestnuts were gone. The banks and hedgerows were broken. Great wagons were standing in disorder in a field beaten bare of grass. Bagshot Row was a yawning sand and gravel quarry. Bag End up beyond could not be seen for a clutter of large huts. "They've cut it down," cried Sam. "They've cut down the party tree." He pointed to where the tree had stood, under which Bilbo had made his farewell speech. It was lying lopped and dead in the field. As if this was the last straw, Sam burst into tears. We just read of an agricultural environment that's been carelessly uprooted in order to make way for a quarry and a new mill. Everywhere, trees and plants have been destroyed, only to be replaced by bare soil. Smoke from the mill's great chimney chokes the air, while the nearby stream has been fouled by the mill's overflow. The ecosystem that used to provide sustenance and enjoyment for the residents of Hobbiton has been degraded and will, if left unchecked, become untenable for most forms of life. The Shire has become a victim of wanton industrialization without regard for its natural world. The ecosystem of this corner of Middle-earth has been broken. Likewise, in our world, ecosystems are at risk. Ecosystems that were created to provide us with much more than the raw materials that supply our day-to-day needs. They also provide us with numerous services that we take for granted, including climate regulation, the water cycle, pollination and food production, and waste elimination. If our technology could recreate these services that God created and generally provided for the good of all, it would cost us trillions of dollars. However, many of us use more than our share, and the many ways that we remove or extract resources from the earth result in large-scale land transformations, placing significant strains on these valuable ecosystem services. In fact, overconsumption and degradation of resources results in a $3 to $5 trillion annual loss to our economic well-being and has negatively impacted nearly a half of the global landmass. Over the years, many authors have tried to get our attention and move us towards a change in these behaviors. Rachel Carson, a marine biologist, is known for one of the earliest and most influential environmental books, Silent Spring. In the introduction to her book, she offers A Fable for Tomorrow, in which she describes the transformation of a beautiful landscape of prosperous farms with fields of grain and hillsides of orchards with white clouds of bloom drifting above green fields, to a place where animals died, illness plagued people, and everywhere was a shadow of death. Silent Spring was a wake-up call to many about the actual costs of better living through chemistry, the promise made by DuPont in a 1930s advertising campaign. In contrast to the unfounded promises of this industrial giant, Carson describes how the uninhibited use of chemicals, particularly DDT, has consequences for ecosystems and human health. She argued that in an age of increasing industrialization, the right to make a dollar at whatever cost is seldom challenged. This assumption can in turn lead to patterns of chemical use without testing, and ultimately to an obfuscation of facts about the implications of these chemicals on the environment. Carson not only had the attention of the American public with her book, but she also testified before Congress in 1963 and warned legislators about the dangers of the unregulated use of chemicals on water, soil, air, vegetation, even bodies of animals and humans. In the same year, the Clean Air Act became law, and the Water Quality Act followed in 1965, becoming law in 1977. Even with expanding environmental legislation and regulations, it is still true that the burden of proof is on proving a chemical is dangerous, rather than on the side of those who introduce the chemical to prove that it is safe. This has resulted in great harm to many communities, ranging from health effects of PCB-contaminated breast milk of the Aequitas peoples living along the industrialized St. Lawrence River, to cancers and other diseases among those living in West Virginia, linked to the contamination of the Ohio River with chlorofluorooctanoic acid from the production of Teflon. Nearly 60 years after the Clean Air Act, many environmental regulations are not enforced. And in 2020, more than 100 of them were overturned for the sake of an improved economy. However, I still have questions, and maybe you do too. What does it mean to reverse these regulations? At what cost to the land and the health of our bodies do we ignore the damage done to creation by unregulated actions? What are the implications for our future? Are we gaining short-term economic benefit while squandering the long-term economic services that God built into our ecosystems? Are we perhaps living in Rachel Carson's Fable for Tomorrow? And if so, how do we best address these questions? Many of us who love the fiction of Lewis and Tolkien believe that storytelling is a critical means of transforming attitudes, including ecological attitudes. According to Langelier and Peterson, people make sense of their experiences, claim identities, interact with each other, and participate in cultural conversations through storytelling. Stories are important because the listener is in a relationship with the storyteller and thereby experiences events in authentic ways. Such experiences can result in transformation of attitudes, as if the events of the story actually happened in the life of the reader. C.S. Lewis explains that we read to be more than ourselves, to see with other eyes, to imagine with other imaginations, to feel with other hearts, as well as with our own. Describing a need for a change of heart within the context of familiar places is an effective means of changing the reader's heart. Lewis and Tolkien both created worlds with places that readers know well and care about. For those of you who love Narnia, do you remember how you felt when winter began to end and you heard chattering and chirruping in every direction, and then a moment of full song, and within 5 minutes the whole wood was ringing with birds' music? Did you notice that the thaw in Edmund's heart coincided with the breaking up of winter? I wonder how many readers see themselves in Edmund and realize their need for spring and a new beginning as well. Tolkien describes the way that stories are able to transform attitudes as recovery. In his essay on fairy stories, he explains that recovery is a regaining of a clear view. If you've ever read Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, perhaps you regained a clear view or experienced the scouring of the Shire in a way that caused you to recognize something about your own attitudes towards consumption. How did you feel when Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin returned to the Shire and were met with this devastating situation? The place they love has been transformed from a comfortable and hospitable land that provided for the needs and wants of the hobbits to an unrecognizable place that is characterized by burning and smoke and with gloomy and unshire-like houses, built where trees and hedgerows had been. The group of friends were not greeted with a beer and pipe as they expected. Rather, upon returning home, they discovered rules that benefited foreigners. They were confronted by a radical transformation of the land that they loved. This was Frodo and Sam's own country, and they found out now that they cared more about it than any other place in the world. In fact, they cared about it so much that they acted. They said, "Wake, all our people. They hate all this. You can see all of them, except perhaps one or two rascals and a few fools that want to be important but don't at all understand what's really going on. But Shire folk have been so comfortable so long, they don't know what to do." The changes leading up to the situation that Frodo and Sam found upon their return to the Shire occurred slowly. Many of the attitudes that ultimately resulted in the scouring of the Shire existed before the Fellowship even began their journey with the ring. Even Frodo and friends prior to their journey shared in the complacency of comfort. However, the distance, both physical and emotional, during their journey allowed them to see upon their return the harm of such attitudes. Literature does this for us. As we read, we can recognize our own stories and possibly even begin to envision a response to the injustices that we discover. While stories may awaken us to the environmental distress of our world, and even to our own sense of loss as nature is harmed, in order to find solutions, we must better understand the problems that we are facing. As Jesus instructed, we must learn to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our mind. This call to use our mind is where science can best help us, as we thoughtfully examine the documented studies of environmental experts. Like the hobbits living in the Shire, many of us have been living in comfort for so long that we don't know what to do. However, our comfort comes at the expense of many of our global neighbors who suffer as ecosystems are degraded. For example, if everyone on Earth used resources at the same rate as the average American, we would need more than 5 Earths. In fact, we use resources so quickly, we consistently reach the annual limit of what the Earth can naturally regenerate months before the end of the year. Earth Overshoot Day is a day each year when we reach our ecological budget and begin to overspend and use resources that are not easily regenerated, if they can be regenerated at all. In 1970, this date was December 29th, but each subsequent decade brought earlier and earlier Earth Overshoot Days. By the end of the 1980s, resource use exceeded regeneration by the second week of October, and we reached Earth Overshoot Day by early September in the early 2000s. In 2019, Earth Overshoot Day was July 29th. But because of the global coronavirus pandemic in 2020, it was 3 weeks later than the previous years. We can thank the need for most of the world to stay home to prevent the spread of a virus for an 8.5% reduction in the use of forest products and a 14.5% reduction in our carbon footprint. You might be quick to celebrate this as a silver lining, but if we hurry to celebrations, we might miss the warning. The remarkable changing trajectory that's resulted from most of the world being forced to stay home should illustrate the impact of our normal consumption. In fact, the trend of earlier and earlier Earth Overshoot Days likely contributed to the emergence of this global pandemic. Our persistent overuse of resources and the impact of our consumption on the environment is directly linked to the emergence of diseases like the novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2. For example, in a span of less than 50 years at the end of the 20th century, more than 40 new diseases emerged across the globe. Those of us with the means to consume resources beyond our immediate needs are often the most protected from the impacts of our resources. We rarely see environments that lead to sickness because we are sheltered from environmental harm by zoning or environmental laws that protect wealthy neighborhoods within wealthy countries. However, when we stand with Frodo, Sam, and Gollum at the gates of Mordor, we can experience what many people living in poverty experience daily: environments ravaged by the dumping of toxins and the uninhibited extraction of resources that lay waste to the land. At the gates, here neither spring nor summer would ever come again. Here nothing lived, not even the leprous growths that feed on rottenness. The gasping pools were choked with ash and crawling muds, sickly white and gray, as if the mountains had vomited the filth of their entrails upon the lands about. High mounds of crushed and powdered rock, great cones of earth fire blasted and poison stained, stood like an obscene graveyard in endless rows, slowly revealed in the reluctant light. They had come to the desolation that lay before Mordor, the lasting monument to the dark labor of its slaves that should endure when all their purposes were made void, a land defiled, diseased beyond all healing, unless the great sea should enter in and wash it with oblivion. "I feel sick," said Sam. Frodo did not speak. This passage reminds me of a place I worked in the mid-1990s when I was an intern with an environmental consulting firm. I was tasked with conducting environmental sampling of an industrial site in an urban center in order to determine the types of environmental contaminants that were present and whether or not the contamination was at levels that required remediation. At the time, the site was occupied by a food production company, but it had formerly been the location of a chemical company. This location is considered a brownfield, a former industrial site that is potentially contaminated with chemicals. And it was the most disgusting place I've ever been. The smell was nauseating, and every few steps there were piles of what looked like chalky white and gooey green chemical residue. It reminded me of the gasping pools that were choked with ash and crawling mud, sickly white and gray. I do not know the ultimate results of my sampling, but I do remember that every day I spent at that location, I felt sick like Sam. Like Sam, I was able to leave and return to my comfortable home. Yet many people do not have the option to leave and must live in close proximity to urban brownfields like the one I described. In fact, the EPA estimates that there are as many as 1 million brownfield sites in the United States, and 85 to 90% of these have not yet been evaluated for remediation. Because most brownfields are located in urban areas, they disproportionately impact minorities and low-income families, whose children are the most vulnerable. Tragically, as many as 25% of children living in the United States live within 2 kilometers of a brownfield. And because the most common contaminants in brownfields are genotoxic or damaging to the genetic material, these children have an increased risk of cancer. This is especially serious news when you consider that industry in these areas are less likely to be inspected for environmental infractions, the EPA is less likely to enforce compliance, and children living in these neighborhoods close to the brownfields do not have equal access to health care. It might not be a surprise to you that pollution with toxic chemicals makes people sick. However, most of us live comfortably away from these issues, so we might not think about this very often. We live in tidy homes with sanitation systems and landfills that keep us separate from our waste and other conditions that we associate with diseases. In fact, in the developed world, we live in a way that keeps us separate from nature altogether. We may visit for recreation, but we do not believe that our use of resources and the way we interact with our environment could possibly make us or our neighbors sick. Our highly developed and constructed landscapes perpetuate the false idea that we can keep ourselves distant from nature and the primary cause of infectious disease, germs. With discoveries by scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch that led to the development of germ theory, the identified pathogens could be controlled, whether through vaccines or medications or even controlling the environment. No longer do people associate disease with uncontrollable phenomena like stars and weather events, but science gives us understanding and it gives us the ability to control the rest of creation. More than 150 years after the publication of germ theory, we find it hard to accept that germs, the environment, and our actions are linked at all. Aldo Leopold, an ecologist writing in the 1930s, sees our perceived separation between humans and nature as a causative factor of land sickness. And his writings urge us to consider that we too are part of nature. He insists that a change in attitudes are imperative to the health of the land, and by extension, the health of the inhabitants of the land. Sadly, we don't heed the warnings of Leopold, and our pursuit of resources has drastically changed our landscapes to the point that by the end of the 20th century, ecologists were reporting overwhelming evidence that human-driven changes in landscapes have altered ecological factors that are involved in the emergence of diseases. In fact, most diseases have emerged after human actions significantly changed an ecosystem, and then human behavior brought us closer to the animal reservoirs left behind. As we entered the 21st century, a comprehensive study by Taylor et al. Reported 1,415 species of pathogenic organisms, probably an underestimate, that range from bacteria to viruses and fungi to worms. 175 of these pathogens are considered emerging or brand new. And of these, more than 75% are zoonotic, or they come from animals to humans. SARS-CoV-2 is not included in these totals because it's too new, but it too is a zoonotic virus that spilled over into human populations as a result of the ways that we extract and consume resources. Most zoonotic diseases that spill over into human populations disproportionately affect the poor, who are nutritionally stressed and who are typically living in ecologically vulnerable parts of the world, places where ecosystems are slow to recover from resource extraction due to fragile soils, and places where pathogens benefit from warm and humid climates. For example, Ebola has emerged and reemerged more than 20 times across the African continent since 1976, as the demand for minerals, timber, and agriculture has transformed the tropical landscape. This landscape transformation has resulted in a decreasing natural biodiversity and has subsequently placed humans in contact with the few remaining wildlife reservoirs. Most of us have heard about the 2014 outbreak of Ebola in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone that resulted in 28,000 cases and claimed more than 11,000 lives. But did you realize that there have actually been 27 outbreaks, resulting in 34,000 cases and the loss of more than 15,000 lives over a span of 40 years? There's strong evidence that Ebola emerges within 2 years of a deforestation event, providing compelling argument to protect forests and the biodiversity within. Even amidst our current pandemic of SARS-CoV-2 that we know to have emerged from wildlife, many of us still don't understand how our individual behavior could possibly be related to the outbreak of diseases on distant continents that now impact us so significantly. It would be easy to blame those living in the place where the outbreak emerged, in this case, Wuhan, China. We could make the judgment that the landscape changes that enabled the spread of SARS-CoV-2 reflects only local decisions regarding natural resources. However, global actions, including our own, are driving the current large-scale landscape changes that accompany disease emergence. In other words, our consumption of everything from chocolate to coffee are the forces causing large-scale land changes. For example, the incredibly diverse rainforests of West Africa, where Ebola emerged in 2014, have steadily been cut due to the expansion of cocoa plantations. As a result, forests have been reduced by nearly 30% since the 1970s, when Ebola first emerged on the African continent. Thus, our insatiable appetite for chocolate and coffee plays a role in the transformation of landscapes, which not only facilitates the emergence of diseases like Ebola, but which is also accelerating global climate change. Many other diseases like malaria, dengue, and Zika are expanding in range and becoming a greater threat to more people as a result of increasing global temperatures and the subsequent expansion of mosquito ranges. Likewise, waterborne diseases, including cholera, are expanding their reach as oceans warm and sea levels rise. Cholera caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae is one of the deadliest waterborne diseases, with a mortality rate of up to 60% if untreated. An outbreak of cholera in Yemen that began in 2016 is one of the largest and fastest spreading outbreaks of cholera in modern history, and it resulted in more than 1 million cases and 1,500 deaths over 4 years. Can the emergence of thousands of diseases be a much needed wake-up call to our world? Will this indication that we're at a tipping point underscore the reality of our own self-interest and need to respond before more pandemics are the result? Like the 4 hobbits returning to the Shire, we've experienced the devastation of SARS-CoV-2. But will we also be courageous enough to follow the example of the hobbits and act in order to make necessary changes to prevent the source of our own devastation? 50 years after Lynn White published his assertion that Judeo-Christian values have led to an environmental crisis, our worldwide crisis is worsening. The wealthy continue to seek comfort through consumption of more and more resources, and Christians are the most vocal climate change skeptics and deniers. I lament this response or lack thereof. Those of us who make the biggest impact on the environment through our consumption are the least likely to be impacted by degrading ecological systems. Cynthia Molobeda writes that climate change may be the most far-reaching manifestation of white privilege and class privilege to face humankind. Caused overwhelmingly by high-consuming people, climate change is wreaking death and destruction foremost on impoverished people who are disproportionately people of color. Significantly, these results are not immediately noticed by those of us who are causing the change. Rather, the delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space is what Rob Nixon has coined slow violence. Changes in climate have radically shifted in a short amount of time. And for the people living in climate privileged regions, it may be difficult to link actions with outcomes. A slow shift in priorities over generations has caused complicit participation in a culture driven by consumerism. However, though these actions may be unintended, they nonetheless harm our planet as they deplete the ability of ecosystems to replenish and renew. Further, any action to slow environmental damage have been hindered by our reliance on and comfort in convenient consumerism. For example, our dependence upon the internal combustion engine has also increased our reliance on fossil fuels and accelerated changes in climate in a relatively short period of time. The internal combustion engine was invented in the last half of the 19th century, and by the early 20th century, cars were widely accessible. Today, 18% of the world's population has an automobile, and most of these are concentrated in the United States and China, the two countries that are contributing the most to carbon emissions, and thus to climate change. I wonder if you know when scientists first realized that the internal combustion engine was not pollution neutral. At the time that they were invented, and for many years after, it was assumed that carbon dioxide and water vapor produced as a byproduct of combustion was not an environmental problem. After all, carbon dioxide and water are harmless to people, and it was believed that any excess carbon dioxide would just be absorbed by the ocean without harm. Those producing internal combustion engines may have made that assumption, but even before the engine was invented, Eunice Newton Foote conducted some elegant experiments that demonstrated that when you increase carbon dioxide in an experimental atmosphere, you increase the temperature of that atmosphere. But in 1856, when she conducted these experiments, the results were mostly ignored, probably because she was a woman. It took 100 years before scientists first measured increased carbon dioxide accumulation in the Earth's atmosphere. And while carbon dioxide is harmless to people, the molecule traps heat in the atmosphere in a process known as the greenhouse effect. Other greenhouse gases are important, but carbon dioxide is one of the most discussed because it persists for the longest time. It's the most abundant and among the easiest to measure. As early as the 1960s, scientists began continuous measurements of rising carbon dioxide levels. They also began discussing measurable changes to climate, and they linked changes in climate to changes in carbon dioxide. In 1988, the first scientist, James Hansen of NASA, went before Congress to warn of increasing temperatures and changing climates. In 1995, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published their first report, concluding that the planet is warming and humans are causing it through activities like driving automobiles. Now it's 2021. The hottest regions of the Earth, these are regions that have a mean average annual temperature of greater than 29 Celsius. These regions are currently restricted to less than 1% of the Earth's surface, but it's predicted that over the next 50 years, this area will increase nearly 20% and displace billions of people. Who will this impact the most? Sadly, those who live in poorer regions of the world that are in ecosystems that are fragile and easily harmed. In contrast, the climate privileged live in ecologically resilient locations, primarily northern countries and temperate ecosystems, which also corresponds to high economic development. However, the levels of consumption achieved by the climate privileged causes devastating effects to climate systems that ultimately challenge the health of our neighbors in the developing world. It might be hard for us to understand a seemingly small increase in temperature of 1.5 degrees Celsius to be a crisis. We might not even imagine that such a seemingly small temperature change could result in devastating changes to rainfall patterns, surface temperatures, and intensity of storms in other parts of the world. However, this is the reality. And if we do nothing about climate change in the next 50 years, there will be more than 143 million climate refugees throughout sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. But if we act now, we can reduce the number of displaced neighbors by 80%. What we consider normal use of resources is increasing each year. Wendell Berry described our abundant consumption as an indulgence in, dependence on, and wastefulness of our economy, which is causing a crisis. Perhaps you've never thought of the dangers to yourself as well as to your neighbors of abundant consumption. Once again, we can turn to story to help us apprehend this better. In the second volume of his science fiction trilogy, Perelandra, C.S. Lewis described the surprise of his protagonist, Ransom, when he first contemplates restraint in enjoying natural resources. As Lewis writes, "Now Ransom had come to a part of the wood where great globes of yellow fruit hung from the trees, clustered as toy balloons are clustered on the back of the balloon man, and about the same size. He picked one of them and turned it over and over. The rind was smooth and firm and seemed impossible to tear open. Then, by accident, one of his fingers punctured it and went through into coldness. After a moment's hesitation, he put the little aperture to his lips. He had meant to extract the smallest experimental sip, but the first taste put his caution all to flight. It was, of course, a taste just as his thirst and hunger had been thirst and hunger. But then it was so different from every other taste that it seemed more pedantry to call it a taste at all. It was like the discovery of a totally new genus of pleasures, something unheard of among men, out of all reckoning, beyond all covenant. For one draught of this on earth, wars would be fought and nations betrayed. It could not be classified. He could never tell us when he came back to the world of men whether it was sharp or sweet, savory or voluptuous, creamy or piercing. Not like that was all he could ever say to such inquiries. As he let the empty gourd fall from his hand and was about to pluck a second one, it came into his head that he was now neither hungry nor thirsty. And yet, to repeat a pleasure so intense and almost so spiritual seemed an obvious thing to do. His reason, or what we commonly take to be reason in our own world, was all in favor of tasting this miracle again. The childlike innocence of fruit, the labors he had undergone, the uncertainty of the future, all seemed to commend the action. Yet something seemed opposed to this reason. It is difficult to suppose that this opposition came from desire, for what desire would turn from so much deliciousness? But for whatever cause, it appeared to him better not to taste again. Perhaps the experience had been so complete that repetition would be a vulgarity, like asking to hear the same symphony twice in a day. As he stood pondering over this and wondering how often in his life on earth he had reiterated pleasures, not through desire, but in the teeth of desire and in obedience to a spurious rationalism. Does hearing that passage cause you to consider that God intends that we use restraint in enjoying the natural resources he's provided for all who live on the earth? In raising this point, Lewis is asking us to think about more than excess indulgence. He is offering us a glimpse into right and proper usage, as well as respect for others who are our neighbors in the world. With this in mind, how do we reconcile the disproportionate impacts of the ways we use resources and the environmental degradation that results? Once we recognize the injustice that has resulted from these actions, we are invited to lament, which, according to J.R.R, is a way for us to recognize the struggles of life and cry out for justice against existing injustices. According to Ra, lament calls for an authentic encounter with the truth and challenges privilege, because privilege would hide the truth that creates discomfort. Lament allows us to confront the truths we have ignored for the sake of comfort and gives those of us living in comfort a means to petition God on behalf of our neighbors in need. Ra cautions that lament is not merely a way to complain, but it becomes a true expression of sadness and a response and acknowledgement of the suffering of our neighbor before God. Lament is the bringer of change, but how can that happen when many evangelicals do not think that the suffering of their neighbors is connected to their personal consumption patterns and their attitudes towards creation? Evangelicals are the most skeptical major religious group in the country when it comes to climate change, and as a result, the least likely to recognize the need to lament changes in our global ecosystems. How can we change our hearts when we have, as Bill McKibben observes in his book, The Comforting Whirlwind, God, Job, and the Scale of Creation, raised more on a pedestal? In other words, we are comfortable in our resource use, always desiring more. We are distanced from most disease and famine and rarely think about the suffering of our neighbors. And like Job's friends, we believe that more is better, growth is necessary, and that we deserve to prosper. According to McKibben, Job is about changing paradigms. For Job, it was challenging the paradigm that God punishes the wicked. For us, perhaps, we need to challenge the orthodoxy of more. But how do we challenge comfort? How can we open our eyes to the need for lament? Story can play an important role in waking us up to the need for lament. Tonight, I've been telling you the story of how we've altered the earth through our use of resources and our desire for more. How we hear and respond to this story will differ based on other stories we've heard throughout our lives. Stephen Buma Prediger, one of the most important voices in creation care movement, says that the kind of person we become depends on the stories with which we identify. In The Magician's Nephew, we see this firsthand. Where Diggory hears music, Uncle Andrew hears only a snarl. Alan Jacobs, in his book, The Narnian, The Life and Imagination of C.S. Lewis, explains that Lewis often creates stories with characters who are blind to anything but their own stories. Are we like the characters in Lewis's stories who are incapable of careful looking and attentive listening? Is it possible that, like the dwarves in the last battle who claim the dwarves are for the dwarves, that we're so comfortable in our pursuit of more that we're only for ourselves? When we read favorite authors such as Lewis and Tolkien and observe their love and respect for nature, we may begin to hear the story of responsibility towards creation in a new way. If we can listen well and truly hear the stories of the suffering, we may begin to realize that we're called to lament. How is it possible for the privileged to truly lament for creation when we do not experience firsthand the suffering of creation and our neighbors? Denise Ackerman, in After the Locusts, Letters from a Landscape of Faith, argues that there are different ways that each of us reacts to suffering. Some respond by succumbing to apathy. According to Ackerman, the purpose of apathy is to block awareness of suffering to such an extent that one becomes immune to it. The residents of Hobbiton had become apathetic, even as they saw their beloved shire changing at the hands of Saruman. It took the return of the 4 hobbits to awaken them to this evil. Even the Ents had become apathetic to the destruction caused by Saruman, until once again, the hobbits' presence seemed to rouse them to the suffering of the trees. Others respond to suffering by withdrawing into silence, which could be, according to Ackerman, respectful and even compassionate, but often it signals withdrawal, not into apathy, but into inactive spectatorship. For still others, suffering can lead to anger or even atheism, and this is precisely why lament is so important. Lament offers us an alternative to believing that God is not interested in suffering. Consider the laments that are offered to us as prayers in the Psalms, or even the words of Paul in Romans 8:22. It is plain to anyone with eyes to see at the present time all created life groans in a sort of universal travail. Have you ever considered that creation itself is groaning in lament as a result of the suffering of our natural world that was caused by the fall? According to Ra, lament is an act of protest, as the lamenter is allowed to express indignation and even outrage about the experience of suffering. Ra explains that the lamenter talks back to God and ultimately petitions him for help in the midst of pain. The one who laments can call out to God for help, and in that outcry, there is the hope and even the manifestation of praise. Lament is a language that is honest, does not shirk from naming the unbearable, and does not lie down in the face of suffering or walk away from God. Lament offers us a way forward, a way to respond to the suffering of our neighbors and the earth. Lament prepares us for action, but sometimes it is still difficult to find a way forward. Ackerman alerts us to the warning signs of apathy, silence, and disbelief. But as Dickerson and Evans argue, Tolkien in his storytelling provides us with a way to move forward with environmental action, including recognition that inaction results in further harm, abandonment of despair for the trust that positive actions have positive consequences, and ultimately, sufficient care for the created world to do something about the danger. Like Treebeard, we need to break free of apathy and recognize that if we stay home and do nothing about environmental harm and climate change, doom would find us anyway, sooner or later. Evangelicals, especially those in the United States, need to question their reluctance to agree that our climate is changing. While most of the world is concerned about changing climates, our own apathy and inaction is causing further harm and pushing us closer and closer to tipping points that could prevent ecosystem repair. But unfortunately, despite scientific consensus regarding climate change, all too often the evangelical community remains silent on this issue. This silence is a type of denial or disbelief. Thus, even if we do not deny the science of climate change, it is still possible that we deny the implications of climate change as reinforced by our inaction. Mola Beta would argue that this silence is a form of structural violence and exerts harm on our neighbor. She asserts that the power of this type of violence lies in its ability to remain invisible or ignored by those who perpetuate it or benefit from it. It would be easy to despair once we realize the harm our silence causes, but if we take action, we can see positive change. We learn this from Merry and Pippin in The Lord of the Rings. It would be easy to think that these characters are inconsequential because they're small and often in need of rescue. However, in the short time that they were with Treebeard, he was encouraged to act. "I will stop it," he boomed, "and you shall come with me. You may be able to help me." Indeed, they were able to help, as Gandalf explained to the Fellowship. Their coming was like the falling of small stones that starts an avalanche in the mountains. Even as we talk here, I hear the first rumblings. Saruman has best not be caught away from home when the dam bursts. We should follow the Hobbit's example and fight against apathy, silence, and despair, to do our part to push back against the orthodoxy of more. There is no doubt that lament is difficult when you're not personally experiencing the suffering. However, we are all called to lament the effects of our consumerism on creation. Christian teachings about Imago Dei reinforce that humans are set apart from creation, and this tendency to see ourselves as distinct from nature facilitates the overuse of resources and the transformation or destruction of landscapes. These behaviors are justified by an interpretation of Genesis 1:28 to have dominion over and subdue creation. Understanding Genesis in this manner allows us to rationalize overuse of resources and an economy built on the perceived abundance of more. There is no doubt that resource use in the developed world is built on the economic value of resources. In fact, the father of American forestry and the first chief of the United States Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot, described the importance of prosperity to his model of resource management when he said, "Without natural resources, life itself is impossible. From birth to death, natural resources, transformed for human use, feed, clothe, shelter, and transport us. Upon them we depend for every material necessity, comfort, convenience, and protection in our lives. Without abundant resources, prosperity is out of reach. When prosperity is our goal, we end up with landscapes like the one described in C.S. Lewis's poem, The Future of Forestry." He says, "How will the legend of the age of trees feel when the last tree falls in England? When the concrete spreads and the town conquers the country's heart, when contraceptive tarmac's laid where farm has faded, tram line flows where slept a hamlet, and shop fronts blazing without a stop from Dover to Rath have glazed us over. Simplest tales will then bewilder the questioning children. What was a chestnut?" Envisioning a world where there are no trees should make us change our behaviors so that we are more than ourselves and see the future implications of our consumption. Accordingly, it seems that the first step must be to help people recognize that their behavior is linked to global environmental problems. Bill McKibben notes that many churchgoers view creation care as a luxury that you would get to after you dealt with poverty and war. But what many churchgoers don't understand is that war and poverty are directly linked to environmental damage, as many conflicts begin over rights to resources. Additionally, conflict damages the land further and exacerbates or perpetuates poverty through decreased access to resources or displacement of human populations. Environmental damage and climate change are also combining to increase the suffering of the vulnerable neighbors by accelerating factors that lead to drought, famine, and disease emergence. Sadly, those impacted the most by changing ecosystem services are the least likely to be consuming the resources that facilitate these changes. Just as those of us who consume the most are the least likely to experience negative effects and are therefore not likely to be motivated to change this behavior. However, Scripture calls us to lament the suffering of both creation and our neighbor. In this way, lament leads us to action and a shifting of the paradigm of more. We need to realize that, like Edmund, we will always want more Turkish delight, yet we will never be satisfied. In spite of a very significant challenges, we can fight against apathy, silence, and inaction, and begin to alter the behaviors that have resulted in the suffering of our neighbors and a planet in crisis. Just like in Narnia, we may be living in a winter without a Christmas, but if Christians can lead the way in moving the privileged away from the orthodoxy of more, together we will be able to make real changes that in turn will loosen the grasp of winter upon our global world and bring about the hope of spring once again. Thank you very much. Dr. Noah Toly will now be introduced for his response.
Thank you, Dr. Page, for that powerfully convicting presentation. We are very privileged as well to hear from Dr. Noah Toly, Professor of Urban Studies, Politics, and International Relations at Wheaton College, where he has served on the faculty since 2006. After earning a BA and MA at Wheaton College, he went on to pursue a PhD at the University of Delaware with a specialty in urban public affairs and public policy. He is the author of multiple books and numerous articles, and was also named an emerging leader by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And in 2015, he was the first ever recipient of the Emerging Public Intellectual Award given by a coalition of North American think tanks in collaboration with the Center for Christian Scholarship at Redeemer University College. I would also like to add that he is an emerging environmentalist. Not only has he co-edited a collection of essays called The Urban Climate Challenge, but Oxford University Press will soon be publishing his book entitled The Gardener's Dirty Hands, The Tragic, the Environment, and Christian Ethics. Clearly, Dr. Toly is an apt respondent this evening. Dr. Toly.
Thank you, Dr. Downing. I'm honored to participate in the Hansen Lectures at the Wade Center tonight. For almost a year, we've lost so much to COVID and to COVID restrictions. And with each passing month, I've appreciated all the more those who have gone out of their way to carry on, despite the limitations, with some of the programming that makes Wheaton Wheaton. Excellent music, excellent lectures like these. I could go on, but let me just say thank you to the Downings and the Wade Center team for putting on such a terrific series in the midst of these difficulties. It is also wonderful to learn so much from my colleague, Dr. Kristen Page, along the way. Not only have I had the chance to read her work carefully and reread The Scouring of the Shire for this occasion, but Dr. Page also sent me articles on climate change written in Elvish and Dwarf runes, which I couldn't read, though I tried. So if you were impressed by her research for this paper, know that it's even deeper than it first appears. I'm especially glad to be invited into this conversation at this point, the penultimate word in her trilogy of talks. I don't know where exactly Dr. Page's third lecture will ultimately end up, but if this series were Dr. Page's Oresteia, this lecture would be her libation bearers. If this series were her Star Wars, this lecture would be her Empire Strikes Back. If it were her Lord of the Rings, this would be her Two Towers. I happen to love the long, dark middle of many trilogies. I love their in media res beginnings and their unresolved ends. They rhyme with a time like ours, with long, confusing waits for a vaccine finally rolled out, where people can see the end, like a trickle of light through the very edge of Mirkwood Forest, but they don't know if they'll make it. More importantly, they rhyme with a time between times, the long stretch between the execution, resurrection, ascension, and session of Jesus Christ, and his coming again in power to finally deliver us both from the terrors of the world and from the errors of our ways. A time when the Spirit of God puts the possibilities of transformation within our reach, but the powers and principalities keep those possibilities just beyond our grasp. A time when the whole creation, as Dr. Page has reminded us, can see the glorious end, but groans through the long, inglorious middle. Putting it this way, it's no wonder that Dr. Page turned to lament as her theme for this middle lecture on Middle-earth, and I appreciate that she did. Her focus on lament begins to open us up to the minor keys in which Scripture is often written. Think of Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Kings, Ecclesiastes, Job, Jeremiah, Lamentations, and many of the Psalms. And many of the minor prophets spoke in minor keys, and that's just the Old Testament. If you think the massacre of the innocents, the flight to Egypt, and the passion narratives are in major keys, then I'm not sure we're reading the same Gospels. Without these parts of Scripture, the Christian narrative would be like the chronicles of a realm with no stone table, no winter, as if the children walked through the wardrobe and entered the beautiful Narnian spring. That would be a story of multidimensional ecotourism with talking animals. Or it would be like Gandalf telling Bilbo not to worry about returning the ring. You don't have to face a perilous and uncertain journey to the cracks of doom in the depths of Orodruin, the Fire Mountain, beset by foes and sometimes by friends, while being hollowed out by temptation. Instead, you just box the ring back up, be sure to include the packing slip and shipping label, and set it out for UPS to take back to the Mount Doom Nordstrom, and they'll credit your account a few days later. That story would be a meaningless joke that would not only diminish the length of the account to a mere 69 pages, I did tally them in my copy, but would change the ultimate point of the story. It would turn the story of Sauron's final defeat into a cheap trick if the triumph could be so certainly and costlessly accomplished at any time. It would no longer be about the fellowship's exercise of responsibility and growth in virtue, or the triumph of justice and joy in Middle-earth, but it would be about a sort of bureaucratic and logistical success. The story of Frodo and Sam standing at a customer service desk saying they'd like to return a ring would be at best transactional rather than transformative. And it is this transformative dimension that demonstrates the potential for these long, dark middles to become part of the response to a key challenge in sustainability, public health, and environmental justice. That challenge is the assumption that knowledge, information, or data is adequate to the task of reform in these arenas. The entire history of these areas of study and activism is dotted with the hard lesson that knowledge is never enough. Over and over and over and over, Researchers, policymakers, activists, and others are mystified by the gap between knowledge and action. Take, for example, Jane Addams, who counted significant public health reforms among her many contributions to Chicago. Many of her colleagues and allies expected that documenting the facts about typhoid and its effects on poor communities would be adequate to prompt reform, but they were wrong. Or take, for example, David Naguib Pello's Garbage Wars, the struggle for environmental justice in Chicago, which includes an account of a community documenting illegal dumping and the assumption that the knowledge of the situation would be transformative, but no dice. Or take the case of climate change, where it's certainly not for lack of data or adequate scientific consensus that we have made such little progress. The entire history of the environmental movement in all its facets could be written as a story of the necessity but insufficiency of knowledge. So what do we need to go with knowledge? A transformation of our perspective, desire, judgment, and hope. That's what all these long, dark middles do. Whether vicariously or intimately, they not only enrich or enhance our stories, imbuing them with greater meaning or heightening the tension so that the end is somehow more intense, but they are pedagogies of subversion. As the late Cardinal Paulo Evaristo Arns, Archbishop of Sao Paulo, said, to subvert means to turn a situation around and look at it from the other side. That is, from the side of the people who have to die so that the system can go on. Pedagogies of subversion then purify and transform our perspective, desire, judgment, and hope by turning the situation around and looking at it from that other side. The experiences, stories, and practices that instruct us in this way are, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes, experiences of incomparable value that teach us to see, quote, from the perspective of the outcasts, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed, and the reviled, from the perspective of the suffering. From, as Dr. Page might put it, the perspective of neighbors enduring environmental degradation. They not only teach us to see, but they transform our desires and judgments. The practice of lament, admitting and mourning that things are not the way they're supposed to be, quickly crowds out our desires for the status quo, the judgment that everything is as it ought to be, or even close enough. And desire and judgment transformed by lament through the long, dark middle teach us not only to act boldly, but to hope truly. It's the bondage in Egypt that teaches us the meaning of freedom in the promised land. It's the lengthy exile that instructs us in proper longing, not the false prophecy of a 2-year return. It's you who hunger now that shall be satisfied, and you who weep now that shall laugh. And whatever else we take these Beatitudes to mean, it is fair to wonder whether the blessed are those whose divine dissatisfaction, to borrow a term from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., is so deep that only the kingdom of God can possibly match it. And when it does, the satisfaction is incomparably great. Writing from prison to his friend Eberhard Bethge on the second Sunday of Advent, 1943, Bonhoeffer had something to say about penultimate words. He wrote, "I notice more and more how much I'm thinking and perceiving things in line with the Old Testament. Thus, in recent months, I have been reading much more the Old than the New Testament. Only when one knows the name of God may not be uttered, may one sometimes speak the name of Jesus Christ. Only when one loves life and the earth so much that without it, everything seems to be lost and at its end, may one believe in the resurrection of the dead and a new world. Only when one accepts the law of God as binding for oneself, may one perhaps speak of grace. And only when the wrath and vengeance of God against God's enemies are allowed to stand, can something of forgiveness and the love of enemies touch our hearts. Whoever wishes to perceive things too quickly and directly in New Testament ways is, to my mind, no Christian. One can and must not speak the ultimate word prior to the penultimate. Again, I'll repeat two parts of that. Only when one loves life and the earth so much that without it, everything seems to be lost, and at its end, may one believe in the resurrection of the dead and a new world. One can and must not speak the ultimate word prior to the penultimate. Dr. Page, we are looking forward to your third and final lecture, your ultimate word on regaining wonder and joining the chorus. But we are looking at it from a long way off. I would say that we can't wait for it, but we must wait. I'm grateful that we can't binge watch your talks or fast forward past this one, because we need to let this word sink in. The ultimate word must not come before the penultimate word. And now we're ready to open things for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Toly. I want to remind our listeners that you can click on the Q&A button on your screen and enter questions. And while you are doing so, Dr. Toly has privilege of asking the first question to Dr. Page. So, Dr. Toly.
Dr. Page, thank you again for your lecture. There wasn't much left for me to say, aside from words of appreciation and resonance after you were done. But I do have a question about what is fertile ground for lament? Or another way to put this is, what are the conditions for the possibility of lament? You do mention that we don't want to lament, that there's resistance to lament. I think about all the communities that I want to engage in this practice, churches or our own Wheaton College community with students. What needs to be there ahead of time for us to be open to this practice and vulnerable to the changes that it might make in us?
Thank you, Dr. Toly, and thank you so much for your amazing response. So much to think about. Well, you know, I think that I've been thinking about this question actually a lot this week. What I hoped that people would understand from my talk is that there really aren't easy answers to the problem. We can't just fix it. We are a consumer society. It would be easy for us to just have a checklist, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to not use plastic, and I'm going to do this. But until our hearts change, none of that matters. And so lament is where we have to go. We have to open ourselves up to the pain and the suffering of the world. And it's not what we like, but I think that COVID might be teaching us something about that. I really have experienced students who are wanting to lament more, who are more receptive to the idea of considering the suffering in the world. And I just think that God put this topic on my heart a long time ago, but I think he was preparing me for the time that the presentation came to be.
This is related to that question. Timothy Larson expresses his appreciation for your emphasis on lament, and he wonders about the practice of fasting, whether that is a kind of resource, a way to learn to restrain temptation towards more.
I think fasting is a wonderful way to remind ourselves of how much we're actually engaged in. We don't have to just fast from food, but fasting from the use of lots of resources. I know our family every year for Lent, we fast from things that remind us about the way we use resources. So we might stop eating meat during Lent because what we choose to eat has implications for the earth. And then it's reminding us that we should be turning our eyes to Christ and lamenting the ways that we're interacting with his world.
This could be answered by either of you. This is from Annika Boring. Can either of you speak a little bit more on environmental refugees?
Noah, do you want to answer?
Why don't you go ahead and start? Then I can jump in, no problem.
So environmental refugees are people who are displaced when the landscapes that they live in have changed so much that it can't produce. So often they have large scale changes in their rain patterns, and so they can't grow their crops and they have to move away. So think of the Dust Bowl in the United States. The people that left Oklahoma, the Okies, were environmental refugees. But we're also seeing environmental refugees as ocean levels rise and land is lost to the ocean. And so that's what they are. And the increasing numbers of environmental refugees is just really rapidly increasing, especially from Arctic areas. We don't often think about Arctic areas producing refugees, but Arctic areas and then the hottest areas of the earth.
Yeah, Dr. Page mentioned sea level rise and agricultural changes in the agricultural environment and possibilities for successful growing areas. And I think it's important also to add to that just extreme weather in general. There will be a massive number of refugees from areas with extreme weather, whether that's fire or hurricanes and other storms over the next 100 years due to climate change. And at this point, there is a combination of mitigation that we have to keep in mind, mitigation possibilities, what little can still be mitigated, and then also adaptation. How do we adapt certain areas so that those communities don't have to flee? And how do we adapt so that we may receive them well too, because some of it is inevitable.
Now, can one or the other or both of you answer this question from Alice Thiessen? What are the basic reasons the evangelical Christian doesn't believe in climate change?
Okay, well, I don't know. There are lots of reasons why evangelicals either don't believe that climate is changing, or they don't believe that humans are causing the change, or they don't believe it's a problem. Ranging from the politicization of environmental issues, the belief that if I support reactions to climate change and I'm supporting a political agenda that I don't feel comfortable supporting, to some Christians believe that the earth is changing because that's what God wants. And some people even hold to the idea that if we try to slow climate change, we're going to slow down Christ's return. There are a range of reasons, and I've heard so many from students and other people on campus. I know that I've left many reasons out. So, Dr. Toly?
Yeah, I'll say that I've just finally finished a multi-year project with two co-authors, both former students here at Wheaton, for the Oxford Handbook of the Bible and Ecology, about the use of scripture by climate skeptics among Christians in the United States, almost all of them evangelicals. And one of the things that I would add to what Dr. Page just said is that this is not a pattern among those who identify as evangelicals in other parts of the world. So it is notable that evangelicals in the US have a certain pattern of political affinity that is probably more the source of their climate skepticism than their religious disposition or practice. And that's evidenced by the fact that evangelicals other places with the same religious dispositions, practices, and beliefs don't share the climate skepticism.
We have a double question from Shelby Edgren First of all, last time, Dr. Page, you recommended the Overstory, which shall be read and enjoyed. So if you have suggestions of reading this time, she welcomes them. But she also is interested, and again, this could be answered by either of you, as to how Lenten practices might dovetail with lament.
Sure. Well, I'm not a piece of fiction isn't coming to mind at the moment to recommend, but I reread Bill McKibben's little book on Job, and it was a really it's old, and then some of the science is a little old, but I found it really compelling, and the reread of it was important to me, so I would recommend that book. And Lent and Lament, yes, I think I began writing this lecture during Lent 2 years ago, actually, or just starting to think about how Lent could help us transform. I mean, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create space to put our eyes back on Christ and change our hearts. And I think that Lent is a good time to remind ourselves of the suffering of our neighbors and our call to change our attitudes and change not just our attitudes, but also our behaviors.
I gave a little bit of thought to a question like this ahead of the lecture as I was writing my response, mainly as I thought about those dwarf rune and elvish articles that Dr. Page sent me, and thought about, well, what would be their function in thinking through something like this? And what I arrived at, this may just be justifying their existence a little bit because I find them fun, but what I arrived at was that they instruct us by allowing us to see through the eyes of imaginary characters, again, though, elves, dwarves, describing climate change and climate change in Middle-earth. And then I thought, well, that's a very helpful sort of Lenten practice that we can adopt. It's a helpful rubric for what other books we might read. And so I will add one here. Jesmyn Ward's Salvage the Bones is a fantastic novel about the experience of a Black family during Hurricane Katrina. And if we're going to talk about long, dark middles instructing us, that novel is almost entirely one long, dark middle. It ends with a few paragraphs looking forward. And I don't think it's any coincidence that it's about a Black family in Louisiana experiencing Katrina and it's one long, dark middle. But we can certainly learn from it.
This is a longer question, and once again, is open to both of you. It has to do with the issue of the fall and its relationship to environmental degradation. It's from an anonymous attendee, and here is what the person says. I completely agree with you that the harming of the natural world is worthy of lament and a byproduct of the fall. Neglect of our proper role as good stewards of the world is a sin. But how do we fix sin? How do we fix the death and chaos that is the result of the fall? What was the problem with the fall? Was it the lack of recognition or action of humans? I would venture to say no. The Old Testament clearly demonstrates that the problem, the heart of the matter, was the human heart, which not even the overwhelming demonstration of God's power could soften. So why do we think that our futile human efforts could? One of the principal truths of Christianity is that Jesus is the one and only Messiah saving us from sin, and that nothing but the love of God can transform the human heart. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, clearly I'm not a theologian, but I will do the best that I can do. I'm just going to tell you what I would say to a student who asked me a question like this. Christ is what was done about sin, and I follow him and he has called me to work to change hearts about his world. He loves us so much, and he loves the creation that he participated in creating. And he invites us to join him now in the reconciliation of his creation. So I can't change sin, but because I follow Christ, I can change the way that I act and pursue a life that reflects Christ. And I believe that a life that reflects Christ cares a lot for his creation.
Well, two additional things occur to me, and I say additional because I would completely agree with what Dr. Page just said. One of those is that I'm not sure lament falls into the category of a futile human effort. It's a practice that we learn to adopt from Scripture. It's something that we're encouraged to by the moods and keys in which Scripture is written. And if we're to honor and teach the whole counsel of God, it's something that we need to learn to speak and to feel. And it's something God gives us. So I think it's a gift that God gives us rather than a futile human effort. And so we should expect it to change us. And the other thing I would say is that without reference to where this particular anonymous attendee is coming from with the question, but when I hear it sometimes asked like this, I hear it asked in awfully inconsistent ways. That is, we don't excuse ourselves from action or human effort in other arenas because of the fall. We don't say, we have to soften human hearts and only Jesus can deliver us. Therefore, we don't get involved in anything. I actually don't know anyone who says that. And our selectivity and inconsistency is something we really ought to pay close attention to.
Mm. It's like that verse, faith without works is dead. Okay, here is a question from John Curfey. He says, Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings has a section on the reaction and revenge of the trees, who of course joined the army against the enemy. Scientists now talk about the interaction and communication of trees with each other biochemically. Any thoughts?
You have to wait till the next talk.
Good
Yeah.
answer.
Isn't it wonderful, all of the things that God has created? And I am going to talk about that in my next lecture. So I think that what that tells us is that creation has been made with the ability to recover to a degree, but we do need to show restraint to protect these amazing things that Christ has and God has created for us.
Okay, I have some statements now in chat. This is from Ted Olson. It seems to me that, and this is very related to the last, it seems to me that Tolkien presents Treebeard and the Ents as very much lamenting the smoke always rising from Isengard. But he portrays it and their simple living as not enough. They were ineffective until they took up arms against the destructive machinery. What makes you confident that lament will lead to environmental change rather than personal piety?
Well, I think maybe lament is our taking up of arms. I feel like the Ents were living simply, but they were also pretty apathetic about the changes. Like, they didn't want to get involved. I can totally understand that. My personality is similar. I don't want to cause conflict. And that's the problem, right? So I think that lament is our way of taking up arms. It's our way of fighting against our desire to just keep things easy and status quo. We need to change our hearts, and we need to take up arms to do that.
So I'll answer this by way of reference to an essay that I really like by Nicholas Wolterstorff. It's I I always mix up the book title, it's a collection of essays, and the essay title, but I think it's on teaching for justice, shaping how students are disposed to act. And I think there's a lot that it teaches us on how we're all disposed to act and how we're shaping that all the time. But he talks about us needing, before we even begin to shape our dispositions through reasoning, modeling, empathy, and discipline, he talks about the fact that we need a combination of a Christian social ethic and a capacity for critical analysis of a present social order. And I think that Lament can open our eyes with regard to that prerequisite combination, this Christian social ethic and the capacity for analysis of a present social order. It can help us to see the distance between how things are and how they ought to be more clearly so that we can act boldly. I am not sure that we're inclined to act, and I'm not sure that we know the direction in which to act before we've properly ascertained the great gulf between where we are and where we ought to be.
Thank you so much, Dr. Page and Dr. Toly, for a provocative and very convicting evening. I am sure everybody who participated appreciates what you had to say. I will be drawing the evening to a close right now, and I have several announcements. First, and we had a little teaser for it already, Dr. Page's final presentation in this year's Hansen Lectureship will be delivered on Zoom and live streamed on YouTube as this evening on Thursday, March 18th at 7 p.m. And that lecture is titled, and hence her saying, wait till next time, Ask the Animals to Teach You How to Regain Wonder and Rejoin the Chorus. And the respondent to that evening's lecture will be Dr. Emily McGowan. Before then, on Thursday, February 25th at 7 p.m., the Wade Center will be holding a virtual book launch for Dr. Holly Ordway's marvelous new work entitled Tolkien's Modern Reading, Middle-earth Beyond the Middle Ages. And I actually think that it's relevant to tonight's conversation because it will show that Tolkien was far more aware of contemporary literary sources than many people realize. He was aware of the contemporary environment. So we invite you to join us for both of these events. If you go to the chat, you'll find links there. And if you're not already on the Wade email list, be sure to sign up in the link provided in the chat box so that you can get all our announcements for events like this one and book launches. As you can see, there is amazing fertility to our scholars at Wheaton College. Thank you all so much for attending tonight. Good night.